Well, well, look who's here early tonight. You brought your protection charm, didn't you? I hope so. Tonight, the fire burned strange, and the wind came from the north. You know what they say about northern winds, don't you? No? Good. Some things are better learned through stories than through experience. I was just thinking about my grandfather. Strange old man. Lived alone in the woods for 40 years after my grandmother passed. Never complained. Never asked for company. But every winter, when the snow got thick and the nights got long, he'd invite me over, and he'd tell me things. Things that made me check the locks twice before bed. Things that made me sleep with a candle burning till dawn. One night, when I was about 16, I asked him why he lived alone, why he never came to town, why he kept that old shotgun by the door even though there were no animals around for miles. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Boy, if you ever hear 3 knocks on your door after midnight, don't open it. And don't even breathe." I laughed. I thought he was just trying to scare me, you know? Old man telling ghost stories to keep his grandson entertained. But he didn't laugh. He stood up, walked to the window, and stared out into the black forest. "I'm serious, boy. 3 knocks. Always 3. Never more, never less. And if you hear them, you pretend you're not home. You pretend you don't exist." I asked him how he knew, and that's when he told me. It happened when he was younger, much younger, maybe 30 years old. He and my grandmother had just moved into that cabin. It was winter, just like this one. Cold, dark, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones and stays there. One night, he woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching to the snow outside. He thought it was a deer, or maybe a neighbor, but the footsteps stopped right in front of the door. And then knock, 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 3 times. Slow, rhythmic, like whoever was outside knew exactly what they were doing. My grandfather sat up in bed. My grandmother was still asleep beside him. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to scare her, so he got up quietly and walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle, and that's when he heard it. Breathing, not his breathing, not my grandmother's, someone else's, right on the other side of the door. Slow, wet, like someone struggling to catch their breath after running for miles. And then a voice, soft, barely audible. "Please let me in. It's so cold out here." My grandfather froze. He knew that voice. It was his brother who had died 3 years earlier in a hunting accident. His brother who was buried 2 towns over in the old cemetery. "Please, I'm freezing. Just open the door." My grandfather's hand was shaking on the handle. He wanted to open it. God, he wanted to. Because what if it really was his brother? What if somehow, some way, he'd survived? What if he'd been lost in the woods all this time? But then he remembered something his own father had told him. Something passed down through generations. If someone knocks 3 times after midnight, and you don't recognize their shadow through the window, it's not who you think it is. My grandfather stepped back from the door, and he looked through the small window. Beside it, there was a figure standing there, tall, wearing his brother's old hunting coat. But the moonlight was bright that night, bright enough to see clearly. And the shadow was wrong. It was too long, too twisted, like something was standing behind the figure, stretching its arms around it like a puppeteer controlling a marionette. My grandfather backed away slowly. He didn't make a sound. He barely breathed. And he waited. The voice came again. "Brother, why won't you open the door? Don't you recognize me? It's cold. So cold." But my grandfather said nothing. He just stood there in the darkness, watching that wrong shadow move against the wall. Minutes passed. Maybe 10. Maybe 20. The figure didn't move. Didn't knock again. Just stood there, waiting. And then finally, it spoke one last time, but the voice had changed. It was deeper now, hollow, like something speaking from the bottom of a well. "I know you're in there. I can hear your heart beating. I can smell your fear. And I'll be back, every night, until you open that door." Then the footsteps moved away, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow, getting fainter and fainter until they disappeared into the forest. My grandfather didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire with his shotgun across his lap, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, he went outside to check. There were footprints in the snow, leading up to the door, but they didn't lead away. They just stopped right there on the doorstep, like whatever had been standing there had simply vanished into thin air. And that's when he noticed something else. The footprints, they weren't human. They were too long, too narrow, with claw marks at the tips. My grandfather never told my grandmother what happened that night. He just said they needed to move. They packed up within a week and left that cabin behind. But before they left, he carved something into the doorframe. A warning. 3 words. Don't let it in. If you're enjoying these stories from the fire, if you want to hear more about the things that walk in the darkness, then stay close. Subscribe so you don't lose your way back to the fire. There's always room for one more here. Always. Now, you might be wondering what happened after my grandfather moved away. Did the knocking stop? Did the thing in the woods forget about him? Well, that's where the story gets even stranger. Years passed. My grandfather built a new life in a new town. He and my grandmother had children. Built a proper house with strong locks and bright lights. He never talked about that night in the cabin. Never went back to those woods. He thought he was safe. He thought he'd left it behind. But 30 years later, when I was just a boy, something happened that made him realize some things don't forget and some things don't forgive. It was winter again. I was staying with my grandparents for Christmas. I must have been about 8 years old. My grandmother had just passed away that autumn, and my parents thought my grandfather needed company, so they sent me to stay with him for a week. The house was different without her. Quieter, colder, somehow, even though the fire was always burning. My grandfather had become more withdrawn. He'd sit in his chair for hours, staring at nothing, lost in his own thoughts. On the 3rd night, I woke up to use the bathroom. It must have been around 2 in the morning. The house was dark, except for the dying embers in the fireplace. I got up and walked down the hallway, trying not to make noise. That's when I heard my grandfather talking. At first, I thought he was on the phone, but his voice sounded strange. Tense, frightened. I'd never heard him sound frightened before. I peeked around the corner. He was standing in the living room, facing the front door. The lights were off, but I could see his silhouette against the window. He was holding his shotgun, and then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow knocks on the front door. My heart stopped. I wanted to run to him, to ask what was happening, but something told me to stay quiet, to stay hidden. So I pressed myself against the wall and watched. My grandfather didn't move. He just stood there, gun raised, pointed at the door. His hands were shaking. And then a voice came from outside. A woman's voice. Soft, gentle, familiar. Darling, why is the door locked? I forgot my keys. Let me in. It's freezing out here. It was my grandmother's voice. I almost called out. I almost ran to the door. Because I missed her. God, I missed her so much. And hearing her voice again felt like maybe, somehow, she'd come back. Maybe death had made a mistake. But my grandfather, he didn't move. He just kept that gun pointed at the door and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You're not her. You're not my wife." The voice came again, confused. "Hurt? What are you talking about?" "Of course it's me. Please, just open the door. I'm so cold." "My wife is dead." My grandfather said, louder now. I buried her myself. I watched them lower her into ground. And I know she's at peace. So whoever you are, whatever you are, you can't have her voice. You can't have her face. And you will never get through this door. Silence. Long, heavy silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then the voice changed. Just like in the story he'd told me, it became deeper. Hollow. Wrong. You should have opened the door 30 years ago. Old man, I've been patient. I've been waiting. But my patience is running thin. Then keep waiting, my grandfather said, because I'll die before I let you in. And when I'm gone, this house will burn the ground before anyone else lives here. The thing outside laughed. It was a terrible sound, like wind through dead trees, like bones scraping against stone. You think fire will stop me? You think death will protect you? I'll find you wherever you go, in this life or the next. My grandfather pumped a shotgun, the sound echoing through the house. Maybe, but tonight you're not getting through this door. The laughter stopped. The house fell silent again. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Just watched my grandfather standing there in the darkness, gun ready, waiting. Finally, the footsteps moved away. Slow, deliberate. But this time, I heard something else. Something that made my blood run cold. There were more footsteps. Multiple sets. Like whatever had been at the door wasn't alone. Like it had brought friends. When the sounds finally faded, my grandfather lowered his gun. His shoulders slumped. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. Tired. Defeated. He turned and saw me standing there in the hallway. "You heard it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. He walked over to me, knelt down, and put his hands on my shoulders. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Listen to me carefully, boy. What you heard tonight, what you saw, you need to remember it, because one day it might come for you too. These things, they don't forget. They pass down through families like heirlooms, like curses." "Why?" I whispered. "What does it want?" "Permission," he said. "It needs to be invited in. It needs you to open the door willingly. That's why it takes the voices of people we love, people we trust, because grief makes us weak, makes us desperate, makes us want to believe in impossible things. But you didn't open the door." "No," he said, "and neither will you. Promise me, no matter whose voice you hear, no matter how real it sounds. If you hear 3 knocks after midnight, you don't open the door, and you don't even breathe. You understand? I promised, and I've kept that promise ever since." My grandfather died 2 years later. Heart attack in his sleep. But before he passed, he made me swear one more time. And he told me the rest of the story. The part he'd never told anyone. The part that explained why this thing had chosen our family. The truth is, my grandfather did open the door that first night. Just not all the way. He lied to me when he told me that story by the fire. Or rather, he told me the version he wished was true. The version where he was strong enough to resist. But the real story is darker. When he heard his brother's voice that night, 30 years ago, he didn't just back away from the door. He opened it, just a crack, just enough to see if it was really him. And something pushed through, not all the way. He slammed the door shut before it could fully enter. But a part of it got inside, a small part, like a seed planted in dark soil. That's why it kept coming back. That's why it never forgot. Because once you let it in even a little, it has a claim on you, a connection, and it will follow that connection through your entire bloodline until someone finally opens the door completely. My grandfather spent 40 years fighting it, keeping it at bay, making sure it never got close enough to hurt anyone he loved. But he knew, eventually, it would come for his children, or his grandchildren, or their children after that. That's why he told me the story. That's why he made me promise. Because he knew I was next. And he was right. I'm an old man now, sitting here by this fire, telling you these stories. And I've heard those 3 knocks more times than I can count. On different doors, in different houses, in different cities. It doesn't matter where I go. It always finds me. I've heard my wife's voice 5 years after I buried her. I've heard my son's voice, calling me Dad, even though he moved across the country and hasn't spoken to me in a decade. I've heard my mother, my father, my friends, all of them, perfect imitations, perfect lies. But I've never opened the door. Not once. Not even a crack. Because I know what's waiting on the other side. I've seen its shadow. I've heard its real voice when the disguise falls away. And I know that if I open that door, I won't just be letting it into my house. I'll be letting it into my family, into my bloodline, forever. So I sit here night after night, waiting for those 3 knocks, knowing they'll come, knowing that one day I might be too tired to resist, too lonely, too broken by grief and time. But until that day comes, I'll keep the fire burning. I'll keep the lights on. I'll keep my doors locked and my windows sealed. And I'll keep telling these stories, hoping that someone out there is listening, someone who might need to hear them before it's too late. Because here's the thing they don't tell you about curses: they spread, not through blood alone, but through knowledge, through stories, through fear. The more you know about them, the more they know about you. The more you think about them, the more real they become. So why am I telling you this? Why am I sharing this story with you, sitting there in the safety of your home, watching this screen? Because maybe you needed to hear it. Maybe you've already heard those 3 knocks and didn't know what they meant. Maybe you've already felt something watching you from the other side of your door, waiting for you to make a mistake. Or maybe I'm just an old man sitting by a fire, telling ghost stories to pass the time. Maybe none of this is real. Maybe it's just folklore, old superstitions from a time before electric lights and locked doors. But ask yourself this: when you go to bed tonight and you hear a sound outside your door, will you open it? Will you check? Or will you remember what I told you? Will you remember the 3 knocks? I hope you do. I really do. Because the alternative, well, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Now the fire's getting low, and the night's getting colder. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to this whole story, then you're either very brave or very foolish. Maybe both. If you want to hear more stories like this one, if you want to stay by the fire and learn the old rules, the old warnings, the old ways of keeping the darkness at bay, then you know what to do. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Let me know you're out there listening. Because the more of us there are, the stronger we are. The more we share these stories, the more we remember the rules, the harder it is for these things to take us by surprise. But remember this, and remember it well. If you hear 3 knocks on your door after midnight, don't open it. Don't call out. Don't ask who's there. Don't look through the peephole. Just stay quiet. Stay still and wait for dawn, because whatever's on the other side of that door, it's not there to help you. It's not there to bring you news or deliver a package. It's there for one reason only. It's there to be invited in. And once you give it that invitation, there's no taking it back. The fire's almost out now. Time for me to add another log. Time for you to go check your locks. Make sure your windows are sealed. Maybe leave a light on tonight. And if you hear those 3 knocks, well, you know what to do. Stay safe out there. The night is long, and it's full of things that knock on doors. Until next time, may your fires burn bright, and may your doors stay closed. Good night.